Well, I got a little bit of a tale about barn vehicle. A lot of people have seen it. I started to call this one Barned in the USA, but I figured I wouldn't call it Parked in a Barn, because there's a lot of vehicles parked in a barn. Right up the road I grew up, there was an old barn, and underneath that barn there was a buckboard wagon and their 51 Ford pickup truck that hadn't been driven in a long time. And that wagon and that truck stayed there, and it gathered dust until that barn blew over. Beat all I'd ever seen. It. They just left that stuff there like that. But this is a little bit of an engine problem before we get into the barn stuff. Got a P0122 code for the TP sensor. Let's remove the TP sensor. We measured ground here at the turn area. Right here, this is signal return is basically the ground. It's supposed to be, and that's the ground coming out of the computer. You know, the sensor won't have a separate ground. Everything it gets comes from the computer. And you notice this vehicle control module is the box. See what I mean? It's at the bottom and the top, but just so that when they drew the schematic, you know, the dotted lines means you're not seeing the whole thing in either place, but these two boxes are the box, right? And I could have fixed that by redrawing the schematic, but I wasn't going to do that. So the ground was measured there. So you know that you got good signal, right? P0122 means that it's got low voltage that it's reading from the teacher. All right, we don't read ground or voltage at A or C. This is 5 volts that's supposed to be coming in. And this right here is the signal that's going out. Okay, so if either one of these was shorted to ground, you would have this code. And so we don't ground in either place. All right, let's make another measurement that's pertinent. We don't measure ground nor voltage at pin 12. See, if we measured voltage here, but we didn't measure it there, that would mean this wire was cut. All right, so we measured voltage coming out of that box going to the engine coolant sensor, and we got 4.6 volts, which is you would expect to get. So we got 4.6 volts here, but we got no volts there. So what do we know? All right, this is the circuit again. No volts, no volts. We got ground here. The VCM has failed. It is not putting out any reference voltage, which was the 5 volts, you know. And so that was just the wise. The normal readings would be 5 volts signal return and 0.5, 0.6. You know, GM always like to rest their idle TP sensor readings at 0.5. Ford tended to put it about 1 volt, but they still went to 4.6 at wide open throttle. And this is signal return ground, the sensor was. And this is the connector down here, what it would look like. GM had to use those several, and Ford Power Strokes use that exact same weather pack GM connector on some of their Power Stroke sensors and stuff. Now this friend of mine that worked at a college, an instructor on the other campus, and she said, "Hey, I got this VW Beetle I drove in high school, running just fine when we parked it in the barn." And see, they didn't, and it just sat there. And she figured her and her husband were going to roll it out of the barn, put a battery in it, and fire it up and drive it away. And I said, it's not going to be that simple. Everything's going to be locked up. The gas is going to be rotten. The tank's probably going to be running inside, even if there wasn't any gas in it. And so she went out there and got to looking, and the engine was locked up and everything. It had been sitting there so long that the law of increasing entropy went over. Incidentally, this was my dad's Volkswagen shop back in the 60s. And this is my Uncle Earl standing there drinking coffee at Dad's shop. I don't know where Dad was, but he had a small shop. He could jug like that up and put it on jack stands and get the engine out of it in less than 30 minutes. Really good at that. And also he never charged as much as he would for a tune-up, which is basically points and plugs, and heck, I think it even valve adjustment. He would get $7.50 labor plus what he charged for the parts. We never charged enough money. Now when he did a whole engine overhaul, he would charge a pretty good bit, but a lot of these little right here brake adjustments and stuff like that, he didn't charge near as much as he should have. Well, I bought this buggy without an engine for $100 while I was still in high school. Loved it. This guy stopped by, wanted to buy. I figured $400 would scare him off, but he handed me $400 and drove away on my buggy. You didn't have to have a title in Alabama before 1975, but even now, if a vehicle is more than 25 years old, you technically don't have to have a title to get a tag for it and stuff. And I guess they figure that if it's that old, it's not worth much anyway. But that would depend on it. Well, this old 70 model Ford pickup was one that one of my wife's bank customers found in a barn all dusty and everything, and he got it running without having to do very much to it. Got a tag for it, drove it for a few months, and then he sold it to me, and I had it for a while. But I sold it. But I had to replace the turn signal switch in it because it kind of wasn't working right. But this would have been if I was thinking, you know, when you see trucks like this, and I actually owned this truck, I said, you know, I could have got a paint job put on that truck and restored it and had me a doggone cool ride. Even put air conditioning on it, which wouldn't have been that hard to do. But I just figured I would do it with a later model truck, and that's what I did. And how many of you guys have ever had a vehicle you kept that you sold? And when you sell one, the problem is you spend the money and you don't record the money. And you find out later it's really hard to replace the sold with another one even like it, or even a little better. But anyway, the funny thing about this was, and this is a red flag when somebody is selling a vehicle. If they say the words "I'm not a mechanic," then that basically they know there's something wrong with the truck, but they want plausible deniability. I don't know how many times I've heard it. And when I was driving this truck with this guy, when I was thinking about buying it, I gave him $5 for it. And he says, "Now I'm not a mechanic." And I says, "It sounds like you got a U-joint clicking under there." And he says, "Well, I'm not a mechanic, but the way you put a U-joint on," he started giving me these instructions how to do that. That guy knew more about vehicles than what he was letting on. But anyway, just remember that if anybody says mechanic, they're basically want you to think that they didn't know whatever was wrong with you was wrong with it. It's a 53 Ford back in 1972. I was at a friend's house, and his dad and his brother dragged this 53 Ford out of his late grandmother's garage. And we need to get this car out of there. And it was covered with dust, and it was a 53 Ford commemorative model, 50-year anniversary. It said it on the steering wheel. And it was only 9 years old, and I was equivalent to a 2005 model right now. But we hooked a rope to the front of it, put it in gear, and dragged it down the road, and it fired up and ran, believe it or not. It astonishes me how those older vehicles, even though the gas that had been implemented for 2 or 3 years would still run. But I had a 94 S at college that if it sat there for 3 or 4 months with the same gas in it, without being started, it wouldn't even start until you got rid of that gas and put new gas in it. It's kind of like more. You know, sometimes your lawnmower won't start if it's got old gas in it. But these cars that seemed like they would fire up and run, it just boggled my mind that this car would have been set up for 3 years in the garage. Of course, it was out of the weather, you know. Anyway, my buddy, I was 15 then, he was 16, and he said that he was thinking he might get that for his first car because he had really said that, but his parents gave that thing away and somebody just junked it out. I couldn't believe they did. This was still a nice looking old car. Well, this 2003 Chevy Silverado parked in a barn for several years, and it was a pretty truck and nothing really with it. And they even washed it before they brought it to us to work on. And it started, but it wouldn't do anything but idle, and it didn't even do that very well. It run pretty crummy, but it would idle. And of course it had this reduced engine power message on there, and there was no throttle when you gave it I tried to apply the throttle, you got nothing. I figured, well, we saw damage, which they thought that the whole problem was that the rats had chewed the wire harness. But you know, we found a few, the knock sensor wiring had been chewed, you know, where it goes right under the intake, and all that, really a big deal, and it wouldn't have kept it from starting. So, you know, these critters under there make a mess. This lady lived next to a cotton field, and those rats would get in and build nests under the hood of her vehicle. It was terrible. She came driving it in like that. It's a wonder she didn't set it on. This same lady, this is from the same vehicle, she poisoned under there by the injector wires because it would be skipping and cutting up because they had chewed injector wire. Found these eggs in this nest under the hood of an 81 Cavalier that I went to work on that start. The guy went to the credit union, wouldn't start. His uncle called me. We went over and looked. It was really hot. And we raised the hood on that thing. And you could tell how long it had been since that boy had on that car because there was this bird nest there. And it would have had to have been parked for a little while without for that bird to have time to build his nest. But I guarantee you those eggs were hard boiled by the time we got to it. Anyway, we had to get that nest out of there. That was over behind the passenger side headlight. And then this was another one that we found a nest that, anyway, you know. And my own pickup truck had critter damage twice to fix the wires under there. But anyway. Well, this one student, critter damage, it was student damage. This Trailblazer came in with a leaky radiator, rattling noise, turned out to be water pump. And he was changing out the water pump. He was some capable student, but he didn't factor in that a new air ratchet will snap the head off of a 4-meter bolt, like the ones holding his water pump on. And he popped that thing off up in like that. And so we pull the radiator out. I said, pull the radiator out, pull the condenser out, pull the grill off, be able to sit in front of this thing and look at it while we're working on it. And so I put him to work. I center punched for him, which wasn't that hard to do. And I says, now take this drill and this drill bit and drill it out. And he fooled with it. It wouldn't cut into that bolt like butter. So he said, well, this bit's not hard enough. And another student, be a pretty good student, he got that thing and he started trying to drill. He couldn't get it to go in there. And he says, this is just a sorry drill bit. We're never going to be able to drill this thing out with this. And both of them afternoon jobs. So they left right after that. You know, of course, their heart wasn't in it anyway. And some other students were there working on other stuff. And so I got the stool and I sat down and I got the Makita drill. And so I managed to drill that thing, turn the drill, apply a nice even pressure, and just keep on applying pressure and keep on turning the drill. Spin the drill fast or the bolts will get hard and the bit will get soft and you've lost all of your everything. So I just turned that bit real slow and I and I saw some metal curling out in there and I got in there far enough where I could put an easy out in it and I screwed that thing out of there with my fingers. And I texted them both a picture of this thing and they were angry because they said I had used a different bit. The problem wasn't it was that they didn't have enough grit. That was my funny little thing I said about that. About those throttle body controls, Ford adopted a faster processing black CM before they ever went with electronic throttle control. They lagged a few years behind GM. GM elected to keep the same Delphi unit that they had, but they added a smart box to bring the necessary reaction time for the drive-by-wire. So they, for the drive-by-wire, had this little box that I'm getting ready to show you right here. Notice they put it in the same place they used to put the cruise control, and no throttle wouldn't move. This throttle control was offline. It was just wasn't working at all. Now the wires that plug into it, you know, one set of wires goes to the engine controller, another set goes to the throttle pedal is what it amounts to. So this is, you know, you got this right here. Now I'm going to tell you, I've said this repeatedly about these bodies. Keep your fingers out of these throttle bodies. They won't all do this, but Buddy opened, he just had the throttle body in his hand off the vehicle, opened it with his fingers. It was on a Nissan, and it never worked again. He had to get another throttle body and put it on there and set it up. But what a lot of people don't know is, on this electronic throttle, it doesn't rely on the spring to close the throttle. It drives the throttle closed, just like it drives it open. And if you've got your finger in there and it decides to close the throttle, it will cut your finger off. And so don't open this thing with your, like you would on the older ones. And you don't have any way of grabbing it out here and opening it. What you need to do is have somebody switch on the key without starting the truck. Hold the fuel, the gas pedal, or typically that will open the throttle plate. and then you can wash the throttle body out that way. But keep your and stuff out of the throttle body and let it open itself, and don't open it. You can err on the whichever side of this thing you want to, but I feel like if I don't have a finger in there and open it, even if I'm holding it in my hand out here off the truck, then I don't run chance of causing a problem that I don't, I don't want my ego writing checks my body can't cash. This little box takes input from the 3 redundant accelerator pedal sensors, drives the throttle plate all the way. It watches the blade's position via a runner of potentiometers and talks to the PCM through this UART link. But this box provided the speed it needed. It needs to react instantaneously. As you touch the throttle, it needs to react. So anyway, that's what Ford 500 one time. It was an 05 model. I took there was a problem where if it would turn on the wrench lights, you'd only have about half throttle. It would do this intermittently. And I actually took a PDA scope that was like a $2,000 scope and connected it to the PP sensor, the accelerator pedal wires under the dash. And I wanted to see if I was getting a signal the whole time. Well, the crazy thing about that was I had that scope connected to the accelerator pedal sensor. It would give me a reading scope, but it was doing something to this because the engine controller would ignore the accelerator pedal when I had hooked up. So that basically went bust. Now I might have been able to put some resistors in series and made that work or something. But that PDA scope, it was an American-made scope and the whole thing. You had a computer program you could put on there, look at the scope stuff on it. It was a beautiful thing. And I had that thing, I really liked it until it finally just died. They don't make those PDA scopes anymore. Anyway, so what we found out was there was no ground here, because as soon we found this fuse blown, and as soon as we put the ice in there, and as soon as we turned on the key, pop, it blew the fuse. And was this rat damage? Well, it could have been, but it seemed possible. So the schematic reading showed 1 power and 1 ground. Both of them C1 connector, pin 15 is hardwired to ground, and pin 73 or pin 15 is ground, and pin 7 gets fused through the fuse. There's a note on here if you're just measuring grounds with a test light. Pin 6 is not shown on this schematic, which is the high mount stoplight. And you will read a ground coming through those bulbs, but that's not a ground, that's base circuit where it's supposed to light out, light up the high mount stoplights, which is weird, one way or another. What we wound up here with was we had a fuse that was blowing, and you ought to try to get a picture of a fuse blowing like that, like that one I did. I made a blue flash. Weren't any other grounds, there was no shorted wires, there was no rat shooter. So what we wound up with this thing was internally shorted. Now, what happened? I don't know that it was parked in the barn because of this, because the story was told it wasn't like this when they parked in the barn. They did park it in the barn for a reason. I don't know why. One way or another. I went by the yard and snagged a used replacement module for $30. It's a plug and play. Put the thing on there, and we got really good throttle response. But it was just misfiring and cutting up and all that. But we did get it where we had throttle action after we put this on, and it didn't blow the fuse anymore. So as it turned out, we had a misfire or 6, and a set of spark plugs didn't change the doggone thing. Every cylinder was bouncing gauge around 120, which is a little bit weak. But the non-firing cylinder wasn't any west of them, they were all even. And 6 never hit a lick at any speed, even with the engine running, skipping. It wasn't a skip when it was idling. It went away when you give it the gas, which would have indicated a vacuum leak. Yeah. So swapping coils didn't move the skip, it stayed on the same cylinder. Intake smoke test didn't reveal any kind of an intake leak. Dynamic compression test would be a good idea, but we decided to do one more test before we went that far. So we got our $145 OTC injector tester. And so let's go ahead and test those injectors. We have to take them out. I've got them all laid on the bench in this photo. We didn't have to pull the things out. We can check the injectors with them in place. As long as you can get to the terminals on the injector, you can do that. But I got an old wire harness, and I built up an adapter to plug newer model injectors, because they didn't use this Bosch style injector, although the tool comes with here that you can use to go on other type of injectors and all. You got to have some adapters for some of the injectors if you get this. Okay. And obviously this is for GDI because they fire on a lot higher voltage. We use this thing, and what you do, it's got 3 different settings. Every one of them amounts to a half a second. You can do a half a second pulse, 50 pulses, or 500 pulses, but they all, 500 1 millisecond pulses. And we found out that, you can do it either way, but if you want to pulse the injector, or if you just want it to turn on and off, it just depends on where you put that switch. Tap that button just briefly, and it's going to blink that light, boom, like that. It's the power to your box. And when you've got the fuel pressure gauge on it, you're going to see how much fuel pressure is while it's doing that half a second. Now, the way the old service-way diagnostics to do was it would lower the pressure a certain number of pounds, and it would milliseconds it took to do that, which was a different way, but it gave you more higher reading on what kind of shape the injectors were in. I thought that was interesting when I used to use that machine. Alright, so we put an injector in there and wound up getting this running really smooth. So that was game, set, and match. What would this cause? Notice one of them, whenever we put all this thing back together, one of those guys mentioned one of these pins, only, that's easy to do if you're not real careful plugging some of these things in, rocking it worth. These pins bend pretty easy. So I took a picture of that because it was something I wanted to be able students after that weren't involved with this, This expedition came in here. We had plugged in this thing a couple of years earlier, but I don't know how many miles ago it was. He wanted to put a fuel to start with. He had convinced himself the fuel pump was what the problem was, and so we said, okay, we put a fuel pump in, it didn't check the thing. Serious misfires. But look at this. We had flashover right there, there. And what we did on these, we snatched these things out of the impact wrench. And you might say, oh, that's terrifying, but I tell you what, every time we jerked with an impact wrench, the whole thing came out, because it tends to break that carbon loose that's gripping at the bottom. And I didn't come up with that idea. There was a shop over there close to school, and they always jerked them out of there with an impact wrench, because they had found out that wasn't anything else they could do. And a lot of the times people would loosen them up and put stuff in there and heat them up and do all kinds of crazy stuff like that. But if you tried to bring these things out slowly, it's going to roll out back, and it's going to leave that in there, and then you got to use that special tool to get them things out. We've done that too. But when we started using that impact wrench, you got none to lose, and it typically, see, every single one of them without a bit of a problem. This is one of them 5-4 valves. Now in this same vehicle, when we raised it up, the shock extended more than it ever usually is and normally sitting there, and it started leaking. Well, that wound up being a fix he didn't expect, but you can tell it hadn't been leaking long. It just started leaking when we raised it up to change the fuel pump. Now, if he'd have just let us put plugs in it, which I was trying to get him to do to start with, shock wouldn't have started leaking, and it would have saved him a lot of money. He didn't need a fuel pump, but he convinced himself that he did. Well, that winds us up today, and this is my buddy Donnie's shop. I just thought I hope y'all have a really great week, and let's be careful out there.